On the morning of November 17, 1965, American soldiers walked into a valley that would change the Vietnam War forever. Many of them had survived one brutal battle only days earlier. They believed the worst was behind them. Instead, they were unknowingly marching toward one of the deadliest ambushes ever suffered by the United States Army during the conflict. Hours later, radio operators would send increasingly desperate messages. Commanders would struggle to understand what was happening. Entire squads would disappear into thick elephant grass. And then, the radios would fall silent. For many families back home, that silence lasted much longer than anyone imagined. The story begins in the Ia Drang Valley, a remote region near the Cambodian border. To most Americans in 1965, the name meant nothing, but military planners understood its importance immediately. The valley served as one of the principal infiltration routes used by the People's Army of Vietnam, often called the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. Troops, ammunition, food, and supplies moved through the dense jungle before spreading across South Vietnam. Whoever controlled the valley controlled one of the war's most important corridors. Only a few days earlier, American forces from the 1st Cavalry Division had fought an intense battle at Landing Zone X-Ray. It was the first major clash between large formations of American soldiers and regular North Vietnamese troops. The fighting had been savage. Helicopters landed under fire. Artillery thundered day and night. Airstrikes blasted enemy positions only yards from friendly troops. The Americans eventually held their ground, but both sides paid a terrible price. Now came the next phase. American commanders believed the enemy was retreating deeper into the jungle. The mission seemed straightforward: move several battalions through the valley, link up at new landing zones, continue searching for withdrawing enemy forces. No one realized that the North Vietnamese had no intention of retreating. Instead, they were waiting. Among the units moving that day was the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment. Many of its soldiers were young. Some had arrived in Vietnam only weeks earlier. Most had never experienced combat before Ia Drang. Now exhausted after days of marching and fighting, they prepared for another movement through unfamiliar terrain. The jungle appeared strangely peaceful. Towering trees blocked much of the sunlight. Tall elephant grass stretched higher than a man's shoulders. Visibility often dropped to only a few yards. Every hill concealed another valley. Every patch of vegetation seemed capable of hiding an entire enemy company. Veterans quickly learned that Vietnam punished overconfidence. The enemy rarely announced itself. Instead, it observed quietly, patiently, waiting for exactly the right opportunity. That morning, helicopters ferried soldiers from Landing Zone X-Ray toward another location known as Landing Zone Albany. From there, the battalion would continue moving toward additional objectives. Radio traffic remained calm. Routine. Reports described troop movements, supply requests, position updates. Nothing suggested catastrophe. The soldiers themselves welcomed the chance to keep moving. Standing still in Vietnam often proved more dangerous than marching. Movement gave the impression of control, progress, momentum. As the battalion advanced in long columns through the dense vegetation, officers maintained constant communication over their radios. Each company reported its position, distances between units, estimated arrival times. The system worked well. Until it didn't. The terrain complicated everything. Tall grass separated squads. Small hills blocked visibility. Dense bamboo forced soldiers into narrow trails. The orderly formation gradually stretched farther and farther apart. What appeared on a map as one battalion slowly became isolated groups connected only by radio. North Vietnamese commanders watched all of it. Unlike the Americans, they knew the terrain intimately. Their scouts tracked every movement. They recognized exactly when the American column became vulnerable. Instead of attacking immediately, they waited. Hours passed. The American soldiers remained alert but increasingly relaxed. Some joked quietly with one another. Others adjusted heavy packs that had become uncomfortable after days in the field. Helicopters occasionally passed overhead before disappearing toward distant bases. Everything seemed almost ordinary. Then one patrol reported seeing movement ahead. Nothing definite. Perhaps enemy scouts. Perhaps only civilians. The information reached battalion headquarters through routine radio traffic. The response was equally routine. Continue moving. Remain alert. No one wanted to halt the entire column because of uncertain observations. Moments later, another report arrived. Fresh footprints. Several of them. Heading into thicker jungle. Again, commanders acknowledged the information. Still, there seemed little reason for alarm. Enemy tracks appeared almost everywhere in Vietnam. Then came another message. This time, the voice sounded different. More serious. More urgent. The lead elements believed they had encountered North Vietnamese soldiers. Not many, only a few. Perhaps a reconnaissance patrol. Permission was requested to investigate. Approval came quickly. American soldiers moved cautiously toward the suspected contact. The jungle swallowed them almost immediately. Radio operators continued providing updates. The voices remained calm. Professional. Experienced listeners could hear no panic. Only concentration. Several minutes passed. Then another transmission. We have visual contact. The sentence ended with static. The operator repeated the message. This time, headquarters heard it more clearly. Enemy soldiers confirmed. Numbers unknown. The battalion commander immediately ordered nearby companies to close the growing gaps between their positions. The order came just a little too late. The column had already stretched across difficult terrain. Some companies remained hundreds of yards apart. Dense vegetation prevented visual contact. Only radios connected them. High above the valley, everything still appeared peaceful. No explosions, no smoke. No obvious signs of battle. But beneath the jungle canopy, hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers had already begun moving into position. Entire battalions silently surrounded the advancing Americans. They waited with extraordinary discipline. No one fired. No one revealed their position. Every commander understood the plan: allow the Americans to enter completely. Separate them. Then attack from every direction at once. The trap had taken hours to prepare. It would spring in seconds. The last routine radio transmissions continued reaching headquarters. Position updates. Movement reports. Nothing unusual. Then, shortly after midday, one final calm voice came over the radio. We're moving forward. No one listening realized those ordinary words would become the last peaceful transmission many of those soldiers would ever send. Because only moments later, the jungle exploded. For just a few seconds, everything became still. The lead elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment had reported possible enemy movement. The companies behind them continued marching through the towering elephant grass, unaware that hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers were already closing the trap. Then the jungle erupted. The first burst of automatic fire shattered the silence with terrifying precision. Machine guns hidden only yards away opened up from several directions at once. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the trees. Mortar rounds crashed into the American column before many soldiers even understood they were under attack. Within seconds, what had been an organized march became complete chaos. The ambush had been planned perfectly. The People's Army of Vietnam had waited until the American battalion stretched over a long distance. Instead of facing one concentrated force, the North Vietnamese attacked isolated companies one at a time. The elephant grass worked against the Americans. Some stalks reached 6 feet high. A soldier could barely see the man walking 10 yards ahead. Officers shouted orders that vanished beneath the roar of gunfire. Men fired toward muzzle flashes they could barely identify. The enemy seemed invisible. One moment there was silence. The next, bullets poured from every direction. Radio operators immediately grabbed their handsets. Contact, contact, heavy contact. The calm voices from only minutes earlier disappeared completely. Now every transmission carried urgency. One company reported enemy soldiers attacking from the north. Another believed they were surrounded from the west. Others simply shouted for artillery. The battalion command post struggled to understand the situation. Reports arrived almost simultaneously. Each described a different battlefield. The radio frequencies became crowded with overlapping voices. Some messages never reached their destination. Others were interrupted by explosions. Still, the communications network held together. Barely. The battalion commander ordered nearby companies to move toward the sound of the fighting. Simple enough in theory. Almost impossible in reality. Dense jungle prevented anyone from seeing more than a short distance. Smoke from explosions, mixed with dust thrown into the air by mortar impacts. Compass bearings became difficult to follow. Entire platoons unknowingly walked into fresh enemy positions while attempting to reinforce their comrades. The North Vietnamese commanders anticipated exactly this response. Instead of attacking one location continuously, they struck several points at once. Every movement by the Americans created another opportunity for an ambush. The battlefield fractured into dozens of desperate firefights. No one possessed a complete picture anymore. Inside one platoon, the fighting became especially brutal. The soldiers attempted to form a defensive perimeter, but enemy troops had already penetrated between several squads. Men who had been marching together only moments before suddenly found themselves isolated in groups of 3 or 4. Some never saw their platoon leader again. Others fought beside strangers from neighboring companies. The chain of command became increasingly fragmented. The radios became their only connection to the outside world. Artillery observers desperately called for fire missions. Coordinates were transmitted under intense pressure. American guns miles away responded almost immediately. Within minutes, massive artillery shells began crashing into the jungle around the trapped companies. The explosions slowed some enemy attacks. But the North Vietnamese stayed dangerously close. Often less than 50 yards away. Sometimes much closer. It was deliberate. They understood American doctrine. If they fought at extremely close range, American commanders would hesitate before calling airstrikes or heavy artillery for fear of hitting their own men. It became what soldiers later described as grabbing the enemy by the belt. A brutal tactic, but an effective one. The helicopters overhead faced their own nightmare. Pilots attempted to locate clear landing zones for evacuation and reinforcements. Smoke, gunfire, falling trees. Everything below looked confused. Landing inside the battle risked losing the helicopters themselves. Several circled helplessly, while commanders searched desperately for somewhere safe to land. On the ground, ammunition began running low. Medics crawled from one wounded soldier to another, despite constant enemy fire. Many ignored their own injuries while treating others. Again and again, radio operators requested medical evacuation. Again and again, the answer came back. Unable to land. The battle grew worse. As the afternoon wore on, more American units attempted to break through toward the trapped companies. Instead, many encountered fresh enemy forces waiting in concealed positions. The ambush seemed endless. Then, one transmission reached battalion headquarters that immediately caught everyone's attention. The voice sounded exhausted, breathing heavily between sentences. "We're taking fire from every direction." A pause. "We can't see how many." Static interrupted the message. The operator repeated the transmission. This time the signal weakened. Headquarters requested clarification. No response. Instead, another radio farther down the line transmitted. They're inside our perimeter. Then automatic gunfire drowned out the rest. For the officers listening miles away, the picture became increasingly alarming. Entire platoons appeared to be disappearing from the tactical map, not because they had been destroyed completely, but because communication simply stopped. One by one, radio after radio, silence. Some operators had been killed, others wounded. Some radios destroyed by bullets or shrapnel. Still others had become separated from their units during the confusion. No one knew which explanation applied. The effect remained the same. Blank spaces began appearing where companies should have been. One lieutenant continued transmitting calmly despite the battle raging around him. He updated ammunition supplies, reported casualties, requested support. Each transmission grew shorter than the last. Then came what many veterans later remembered as one of the most haunting radio calls of the battle. "We're still here." Several seconds passed, but I don't know for how much longer. The operator at battalion headquarters immediately acknowledged. He asked for exact coordinates, asked about enemy strength, asked whether reinforcements could reach them. Only static answered. Then, one final burst of words. So many of them. Gunfire erupted directly into the microphone. Someone shouted. The radio emitted a loud crackling sound. Then, nothing. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. The operator called repeatedly. No answer. Again, nothing. Other radio stations attempted contact. Still nothing. For the next several hours, that platoon's position remained uncertain. The tactical map still showed where they should have been. No one knew whether anyone remained alive. As darkness slowly approached over landing zone Albany, commanders faced an impossible decision. Launching another rescue attempt before nightfall might send additional soldiers directly into the same ambush. Waiting until morning could mean abandoning surviving men to fight alone through the night. Neither option seemed acceptable, yet one had to be chosen. Throughout the valley, isolated American soldiers dug desperately into the hard earth. Some held positions only yards from North Vietnamese troops. Others searched in vain for comrades they had become separated from during the afternoon. The radios that still functioned carried only fragments of the larger battle. No one understood its full scale. No one realized how devastating the casualties had become. And no one knew what rescuers would discover when daylight finally returned to the jungle. Night fell over landing zone Albany with terrifying uncertainty. Across the battlefield, scattered American soldiers remained pinned down in small groups. Some had managed to establish shallow defensive positions. Others were isolated entirely, separated from their platoons by only a few hundred yards of jungle that now felt impossible to cross. The firing gradually slowed, not because the battle had ended, because both sides understood what darkness meant. Visibility dropped to almost nothing beneath the thick jungle canopy. Every sound became magnified. Every snapped branch, every whispered order, every distant cry for help. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, knew the North Vietnamese were still nearby. Very nearby. Some survivors later estimated that enemy soldiers occupied positions less than 20 yards away. Neither side wanted to reveal its exact location. The jungle settled into an uneasy silence broken only by occasional bursts of gunfire. Inside the American perimeter, medics worked without rest. Flashlights were almost never used. Even the smallest light could attract enemy fire. Instead, they treated wounds by touch. Bandages were applied in complete darkness. Morphine was administered carefully. Water was shared among exhausted soldiers who had been fighting for hours. Many of the wounded asked the same question. Has anyone heard from the others? No one had an answer. Entire platoons remained unaccounted for. Radio operators continued trying to establish contact with units that had vanished during the afternoon. Again and again, they called familiar call signs. Again and again, only static answered. At battalion headquarters, maps covered with grease pencil markings told a disturbing story. Positions that had been carefully updated throughout the morning now contained large empty spaces. Not because commanders believed every man there had been killed, but because communication had simply ceased. In military operations, silence can be more frightening than bad news. At least bad news tells commanders where to act. Silence leaves only uncertainty. Throughout the night, artillery batteries fired defensive missions around surviving American positions. Massive shells screamed overhead every few minutes before exploding in the surrounding jungle. The thunderous blasts discouraged large-scale attacks, but they could not eliminate the enemy entirely. North Vietnamese soldiers remained hidden among the trees, waiting patiently for another opportunity. Many American soldiers later admitted they barely slept. Most never closed their eyes at all. Every rustling leaf sounded like approaching footsteps. Every distant cough suggested another attack. Several veterans would later describe that night as longer than any they had ever experienced. When dawn finally arrived on November 18, 1965, the battlefield slowly emerged from the darkness. The helicopters returned first. From the air, pilots immediately realized how severe the fighting had been. Trees had been shredded by artillery. Large patches of elephant grass were flattened. Smoke still drifted upward from small fires burning across the valley. Yet the true devastation remained hidden beneath the vegetation. Reinforcements cautiously advanced toward the areas where communication had been lost the previous afternoon. Every step was deliberate. No one knew whether another ambush awaited them. The silence itself felt unnatural. After several hundred yards, the first rescuers found abandoned equipment. Backpacks, helmets, broken radios, expended ammunition boxes. The signs of desperate fighting became more frequent. Then, they discovered the first fallen soldiers. Soon afterward, as they pushed deeper into the battlefield, the scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Many of the missing platoons had not truly disappeared. They had fought almost to the last man while surrounded by overwhelming numbers. Others had become scattered during the chaos and were only now emerging from the jungle after spending the entire night hiding from enemy patrols. Several wounded soldiers were found still clutching their rifles. Some had survived by remaining absolutely motionless for hours, afraid that even the slightest movement would reveal their position. Others had continued caring for wounded comrades throughout the night, despite lacking food, water, or medical supplies. The radio operator whose final transmission had ended in gunfire was eventually located. His radio lay beside him, badly damaged. Whether it had been struck by bullets or shattered during the fighting could never be determined with certainty. But the silence that had worried commanders for so many hours suddenly made sense. The radio had not chosen to stop transmitting. The battle had stopped it. Throughout the day, helicopters carried the wounded away, while recovery teams searched the battlefield. The casualty reports grew steadily worse. The Battle of Landing Zone Albany proved even more devastating than many officers had initially believed. By the time the fighting ended, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, had suffered some of the heaviest losses experienced by an American battalion during the early years of the Vietnam War. More than 150 American soldiers were killed, with many more wounded. The North Vietnamese also suffered extremely heavy casualties, but unlike the Americans, they removed many of their dead from the battlefield before withdrawing. For the survivors, the physical wounds eventually healed. The memories never did. Many spoke for years about the confusion of that afternoon, not knowing where the enemy was, not knowing where their own platoons had gone, listening as familiar voices disappeared from the radio one after another. One veteran later recalled that the most frightening part wasn't the gunfire. It was hearing someone you had spoken to only minutes earlier suddenly vanish into silence. Because once the radio stopped, your imagination filled in everything else. The battle at Landing Zone Albany permanently changed how the United States Army viewed combat in Vietnam. Commanders carefully studied every decision made during those terrible hours. They recognized the dangers of moving long columns through dense jungle. They revised communication procedures. They improved coordination between infantry, artillery, helicopters, and close air support. Many of the tactical lessons learned at Ia Drang shaped American operations for years afterward. But there was another lesson, one that could never be written into a field manual. Technology has limits. The United States possessed helicopters, artillery, aircraft, and modern radios. The North Vietnamese possessed discipline, patience, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and a willingness to wait for exactly the right moment. At Landing Zone Albany, they demonstrated how quickly even a powerful military force could become vulnerable when surprised under the right conditions. Years later, author and war correspondent Joseph L. Galloway, who witnessed the Ia Drang campaign alongside Harold G. Moore, helped preserve the memories of those who fought there. Their work reminded later generations that behind every battle map were ordinary young men facing extraordinary circumstances. The title of this story speaks of a platoon that disappeared. In reality, they did not vanish into thin air. They disappeared behind walls of jungle, smoke, confusion, and relentless enemy fire. For the commanders listening to the radio that afternoon, however, the feeling was exactly the same. One moment, familiar voices calmly reported their positions. The next, only silence remained. Some of those voices would never be heard again. Others returned hours later, exhausted, wounded, and forever changed. Their last radio messages became more than military transmissions. They became the final link between men fighting for survival and a command post desperately trying to reach them. Nearly 6 decades have passed since those terrible hours in the Ia Drang Valley. The jungle has grown back. The shell craters have softened beneath the tropical rains. Birds once again sing where artillery once thundered. Yet for the families of those who never returned, and for the veterans who survived, the sound they remember most is not the explosions, not the machine guns, not the helicopters. It is the sudden silence that followed the last transmission. A silence that lasted only a few hours on the battlefield, but has echoed through history ever since.